the Sustainability Management Master's Program, you're answering one simple question. Do you care about your future generation? If you care about your kids, their grandkids, then you care about sustainability. And a sustainability manager is someone who has the tools to make people understand how they can contribute towards developing a sustainable world. We have both part-time and full-time students. Our curriculum is 30 hours. Instead of thesis, we have a research project course and a seminar course which provides them with the kind of research background they will need to be successful in their job. But at the same time, sustainability is not always everything about environment. It also relates to the business. They will take a sustainable business strategies course. They will take a project management course. Most of these courses are going to be taught by industry people, the people who are doing sustainability on a daily basis as a part of their job. Any organization that has a large number of employees and has a physical infrastructure, they will have to have a sustainability office. If you have the passion to develop and maintain a sustainable world, come to us and we will help you shape your passion into a career which will create an impact.
The Stevens Institute of Technology is proud to present the Hugo New Corporation Sustainability Seminar Series, brought to you by Brown & Codwell, Geocetic Consultants, H2M Architect and Engineers, BEM Systems, and Catalyst Group.
I'm going to start with a focus on history, because what I hope to show tonight is that the challenges we face today with solid waste management are not only not new, they're very much the same challenges that we've had for more than a century. And part of the frustration that I feel often with this subject is the solutions we propose, we have been proposing for more than 100 years. And one of the takeaways I hope you have from tonight is to think about alternatives to these tried and untrue solutions. So these are the foundational questions that I'm going to explore with you this evening. What are the basics of municipal solid waste management? Why do we think they work? Should they be different? Should we change them? Why, if we should change them, and how should we change them? This is a cartoon from a sanitation publication that was it lived for about 15 years, but this particular image synthesizes the problem of solid waste. Once we let go of it, if it's the litter on the sidewalk, like this happy-go-lucky fellow with his beer can, or if it's the garbage in our homes that we put on the curb, or whatever other source of discards we generate, once we let go of them, we are very happy to just disclaim them and forget about them. That's part of the crux of the challenge that we face today. So we're going to go back a rather long way to the 1650s, when Peter Stuyvesant, directing the New Amsterdam colony that preceded New York, he created a law that said the colonists could only dispose of their garbage in one of 5 places. This is a map of the original shoreline of the island of Manhattan, the very bottom of the island, and the grid on top of it is the contemporary street grid, and the pin is at the corner of what is today Bridge Street and Broad Street. And this pin, another location where you can throw out your trash, is what is today Wall Street and Pearl. This is Whitehall Street and Pearl Street, and you notice these are all along the edges of the water. That was intentional. This is Pearl Street and Coenties Slip. Keep that pin in your mind's eye. This is the same place. This pin and this pin are the same location. Everything around here, all of this geography, this real estate, is built on fill. Much of it, forms of waste and garbage that colonists and then later the British and then Americans and whoever was living in New York City, they built out from the shoreline originally. And that's been a tried and, I'll call this tried and true, not tried and untrue, way of dealing with waste and also creating land. But as I hope I'll show by the time I'm done this evening, this particular solution is really not one that is still viable. We're going to jump ahead a couple of hundred years to the second half of the 19th century, when New York City was a thriving metropolis, growing almost too fast for its infrastructure and political system to keep up. But it was by then infamously dirty. If you were a sailor coming into New York Harbor, you could smell the city from about 6 miles out. Other big urban centers had figured out how to solve the problem, but the politicians of the day said that it was too crowded and there were too many different kinds of people to be able to keep New York clean. We dumped an awful lot of our garbage in the harbor, even though by 1888, federal law made that illegal. But we kept doing it, even up to the 1890s. These political cartoons are important sources of information from the era because they don't presume that you read English. In a city that already had dozens of languages in which people were or were not literate, but nobody was literate in all the languages, the political cartoons were a key way of communicating some of the pushback that the local politicians were getting because of their garbage mismanagement. This cartoon is very prescient. The suggestion here is that garbage should be a source of fuel for the poor, for heat and light. Of course, all of the municipal solid waste from New York City now goes to a waste to energy facility in Essex, New Jersey, formerly known as an incinerator, where we do burn that garbage to create heat and light for approximately 10,000 homes in the surrounding area. Of course, it was the most vulnerable New Yorkers who suffered from the garbage mismanagement as the street cleaning department got fatter and fatter in the sense of funds that were meant to be dedicated to the work of street cleaning and garbage collection lined the pockets of local politicians. And meanwhile, it became an increasingly dangerous place to live, New York City, unless you were wealthy, because it was exactly the kinds of diseases that New York already knew how to prevent that were claiming the lives of people whose neighborhoods could not be cleaned or swept regularly. If you were wealthy, you could hire private people to do that, but otherwise you were at the mercy of really abysmal living conditions. These photographs are from 1893 from an issue of Harper's Weekly, and they show the states of the streets pretty much as they were for as long as anyone could remember. This was not a crisis that only happened in the recent past. This was decades of neglect and malfeasance. Until 1894, there was an election and a reform mayor knocked Tammany out of office, not for very long, but long enough. And William Strong was elected, and he chose a Civil War veteran and a self-styled sanitary engineer and something of a showman, George Waring, to be commissioner of street cleaning. He asked Teddy Roosevelt to take on the job before he approached Waring, and Teddy Roosevelt said, basically, are you crazy? No, I can't, no, the job cannot be done. But Waring stepped into it, and he said he had one condition, which was that the mayor let him do the job as he saw fit, and the mayor agreed. Waring, one of the very first changes he instituted was to take a workforce that on a good day looked like this, and he made it look like this. He put the workers in white uniforms to suggest their affiliation with public health. Even back in the 1890s, medical authorities wore white, doctors and nurses. He gave them the same helmets that the police of the day wore to underscore their authority. And the third reason for the white uniform is that it was much harder to sneak off to the pub for a pint if you were dressed in this blazing white. The carters wore the same uniform, but in brown. It's important for me to also add, this structure included a military-based hierarchy that still holds today, so that the first line of defense in public health are sanitation, or in the 1890s, street cleaner workers on the curbs, collecting trash, sweeping in a way that made them accountable for specific blocks. and sections, and they had to report to officers above them in command that went all the way up to chiefs. In fact, the sanitation hierarchy still has 1, 2, 3, and 4-star chiefs, and you call them chiefs or boss, but this is an important innovation that Waring brought that still holds and that makes the job far more, I'm going to say, feasible, doable, even as it creates sort of other sets of problems. Waring made sure that the horses of the day were the right strength and breed, and that there were people trained to care for them, so that there were Department of Street Cleaning veterinarians. This is basically an example of roll call. This is about 20 years later, because you see that the hats have changed. But so roll call is when your horse and cart are hitched up ready to go and you're waiting for your orders, and you hit the streets. These carts held approximately 3 cubic yards. Waring also instituted the country's second ever curbside recycling program. It wasn't called that at the time, but he was determined to make the Department of Street Cleaning economically independent. And he knew that if material culled from the waste stream that was saleable or reusable, if that were as effective as possible, it would generate enough revenue for the department to have its own source of funding. The problem was that in formalizing recycling, he threatened to disenfranchise hundreds, if not thousands, of New Yorkers whose existence, whose survival depended on being able to scrounge food and saleable bits and pieces from the trash. So he was sensitive to this challenge, and he hired women among the workers who were on the sort lines of this facility, for example, on East 16th Street in the East River. It's long gone, but you see here in the end, there's a woman here who's part of the workforce. It didn't completely protect all the people made vulnerable by this innovation, but he didn't ignore that. So was he effective? He was effective. These photos, the first set that I showed you, they were published in Harper's Weekly in 1895, demonstrating what Waring had managed to accomplish in a very short time. He had only been in office since January of 1895, and everyone assumed that he was not going to be able to do what he claimed he could do. But he showed them that they were wrong, and this was a marvelous demonstration of his success. So what do you do to celebrate this kind of achievement? Well, obviously you throw yourself and your workers a parade. The very first street cleaners parade was on May 26, 1896, down Fifth Avenue from Central Park, past the viewing stand at the Croton Reservoir. It's now the main branch of the New York Public Library. But at first the press was very skeptical, but they noticed the size of the crowds, right? These were the families and loved ones of the workers who had transformed the city. And these guys became heroes. They became kind of pop culture heroes the way, imagine if Beyonce or Taylor Swift were singing hit songs about sanitation workers today. This is Charlie Chaplin in a 1931 film called City Lights. He's taking on the role of, they were nicknamed the White Wings because of their white uniform. This is another film from around the same time called Three on a Match. By the way, if you see this film, which I highly recommend, it's a lovely, lovely silent movie. When he's in this role, it's completely accurate, including things like this can on wheels, which supposedly George Waring's wife invented. I haven't found confirmation of that. But even this handle in the archives and sort of memorabilia collection of the Department of Sanitation today, they have shovels like that. So as time passed, the uniform changed a little bit. The hat now, it still reflects what the police wear, but and they're still in white, unfortunately, for whoever had to do the laundry for these guys. That's a research project waiting to be done. You could fit a lot of clothes underneath it for cold weather when you needed to be out in the streets in the winter. As the can carry was a part of the job until the 1980s, actually. And as the city's politics shift and we move into the 20th century, we see politicians like Fiorello LaGuardia here, mayor, every now and then taking the issue of street cleanliness and sanitation very seriously, but often only in response to a crisis. This picture is from about the 1950s. The uniforms were no longer white after the Department of Street Cleaning became the Department of Sanitation in the 1929-1930 fiscal year. The trucks are still white, and that's, I've been told, sort of in homage to the White Wings. I don't know if that's true. I was on the job in the mid-aughts, 2004 and 5, and this is my class. These are my fellow, we're about to be inducted into and take an oath to the city, inducted into the Department of Sanitation. This is a similar ceremony from just a couple of years ago, and this line of people in the white gloves have just taken the first step up into the ranks of management. They were sanitation workers, and now they have been promoted to supervisor. So they are now going to be the bosses of all of these folks, which is the most strenuous and challenging shift in your career in sanitation. If you can hang on and make this work, you can keep climbing that ladder if you want to. But this is where this is the test, is that job title. Okay, so two essential tasks that municipal solid waste management has to pay attention to. The first was the beginning part about how the entire system was put in place. And now we have logistics. Back in the day, it was a horse on a cart and a horse on another kind of cart. This one is wooden, this one is metal. This is another innovation that Waring put in place, much easier to clean, and they lasted longer. The carts, when they were full, were taken to the piers where they were dumped into barges that were waiting down below. And then you went out for another load. Given the small size of the cart, you would have had to make many trips in a given 8-hour day. When you tipped the cart into the barge, one hoped that the material actually landed in the barge, but it often didn't. There's a marine archaeology to do around the fringes of around the waters of New York City, based on this unfortunate practice. And then the barge, when it was full, I'm using the word barge, back then it was called a scow. It would have been tugged out to sea, unless, of course, the entire enterprise sank. There was a story about a fellow in the 1870s who moored a scow in the East River and told the city that it was welcome to use the scow to dump carts. And so the city was glad to take advantage of it. It turned out that particular scow had no bottom. The fellow believed that if enough garbage were dumped, he would then have created a little piece of real estate and could be rich. As you probably know, just dumping garbage into the water is not the way you make land. You can use garbage to make land, but it takes a little bit more engineering than that. This photo is a little hard to read, but there are human beings on this scow. They're called trimmers. Their job is to make sure that the load is balanced so that when the tugboat pulls it out to sea, it's not a difficult voyage. The real purpose, well, the purpose is to trim the barge, but it's also to pull material off the barge, off the scow, and get it to people, their family members generally, who were living under the piers all year long, taking those materials and sorting them into whatever saleable categories there might be, and also living on them. In other words, there was edible food in the collection as well. And as I say, this was entire families doing this work. This is not the practice that happens today when one is filling a barge with material to go to a landfill or to be dumped in the ocean. We don't have scow trimmers anymore. And we certainly, even if we did, would not be dumping on their heads. But I show this film partly because it really gives a nice sense of the working conditions that these laborers faced. In general, the workers on the dock, on the pier, are Irish, and the workers on the barge are Italian. There were some city council hearings questioning if this work was hazardous to their health. And George Waring himself said, oh, no, they're Italian. They are ideally suited for this labor. You or I might find it a hazard to our health, but Italians, they thrive in this kind of work. So don't worry about it. They'll be fine. But remember, there are families living underneath this pier. It's not even just the workers themselves exposed to these kinds of, by today's standards, pretty unimaginable, I would say challenges, but we could even say horrors. So once the scows were full, they were tugged out to sea. Where's my cursor? And they were dumped either at a landfill or just as often at sea. They were supposed to go at least 17 nautical miles out. If the harbor master was looking the other way, or they could pay a bribe, they didn't have to go that far. Once they got to the offloading location, this looks kind of precarious, and in fact it was. Sanitation work, even now, is one of the 10 most dangerous job categories in the country. And back then it was also extremely hazardous. This guy looks like he's about to fall in. It happened rather often, and when they did, they were usually not recovered. So yeah. So picking it up, that's task one. Putting it down is the other half, or the second task. Once you pick it up, you got to figure out what to do with it. By the time New York City no longer had any landfills or solid waste disposal options of its own, except Fresh Kills Landfill. It was by then the early 1990s. This map is not at all to scale, but I include it just to give you a sense of the relationship of where Fresh Kills was connected to the rest of the city. It was, there were some truck dumps from Staten Island, but it was largely barge fed. This is what it looked like in 1943. You can see that it's been cut up a little bit. They were trying to figure out ways to develop it and to do mosquito control. It was not understood back then that all of this kind of area these were wetlands. This is an invaluable ecosystem and set of habitats that is not only important for nature, and I'm using that word almost with air quotes because it's such a huge category, but very important for flood control and the general health of the surrounding area. It was thought then just to be swamp and to be mosquito breeding grounds and to be something that had to be filled in. This map is from 1995, when Fresh Kills was by then considered to be the largest human structure in the history of the planet, and so big that there was no place to stand where you could see the whole thing just with, you could not have a vista of the entire place. But notice what this map says. There was no plan yet to close Fresh Kills. Well, there had been many, many plans, and they'd been abandoned one after the other over the years. This map says Fresh Kills Park undeveloped, as if you can't actually say landfill or garbage dump or something more accurate. I love that. I love this weird undeveloped, this euphemism. So when Fresh Kills opened in 1948, the city promised that it would only be open for 3 years. When it first opened, it was not a landfill, it was a dump. If you were standing in one of its bucolic little coves here, it looks kind of like a lovely corner of Staten Island. But if you turned in the opposite direction, this is what you saw. And this is not landfill engineering or sanitary engineering. This is just dumping. So 3 years came and went. The landfill stayed open. And then stayed open some more. There was a plan in the 60s to close it and turn it into a ski area, because by then the hills were already high enough. But city planners forgot that decomposing garbage, particularly anything organic, lets off a lot of heat. So it wouldn't have been very practical as a ski resort. When the barges went to Freshkills, and again, this is the same system from the 19th century. They're not dumping at sea anymore. That was finally outlawed in 1934 by the United States Supreme Court. So they're going to Freshkills and other landfills, and the barges are being offloaded by these cable cranes, and the garbage is being put into these three-sided contraptions called Athay wagons. There's no roads, there's no need for roads because they're on tractor treads, and they're pulled up to whatever is the active face right then, and they're tipped. This is the supervisor's station, so that this is the fellow who's also, he's dragged around by, his office is dragged around by a tractor as well. And the folks at Freshkills have actually preserved one of these, which is kind of lovely. So I mentioned before that Freshkills started as a dump. There's a very significant difference between a dump and a landfill. A dump, as the name suggests, is just garbage is just dropped, kind of like littering at the meta level. But a landfill is a modern sanitary landfill is a highly engineered, extremely carefully planned facility. The Freshkills has methane retrieval pipes that were put in place in the 80s when the landfill was still growing, but by then had millions of tons in place. Just putting that methane retrieval network in place was itself an engineering marvel. It also had to be lined because federal laws about landfill safety have changed, of course, as they must, and they get more rigorous as time goes on. So there is a clay lining that I forget how deep it goes, I think to 80 feet, that surrounds Freshkills on the land side. And I don't know about the water side, but that was an engineering challenge of significant proportions, that no one ever looks at a landfill as something that is a significant site of national historic importance. There was an effort to do that with the first ever sanitary landfill in Fresno, California in the early 2000s, and the press jumped on it and made a mockery of it, and then that whole effort fell apart. No one has ever thought to do it with Freshkills or proposed to do it with Freshkills, but I think it's a pretty significant accomplishment, what Freshkills eventually became. This was the idea when it was supposed to be closed in 51. Robert Moses said, okay, this is what we're going to do with it, and won't it be marvelous? But this plan never came to pass. It went charging forward past 51, 60, 70, 80. This is from the late 80s, where you have the barges again. Now you have hydraulic cranes offloading to they were called pads, where the garbage was an interim place. And then you had front end loaders. It's hard to tell scale here. This bucket holds approximately the same quantity as more than one garbage truck. So we're looking at between 15 and 20 tons just in this one bucket. To go into this immense dump truck called a pay hauler, that's the cab. Just to give you a sense of scale, this is a group of students I took out to Freshkills in 95. That's the tire of this FEL, front end loader. And then the pay haulers would go up to the active face and dump. And then you had these bulldozer compaction. It's a little bit hard to see. The wheels here are heavily studded. This compacted the trash. So some of the technology is different from what it was back in the day. And at the same time, it's the same idea. This is what Freshkills is supposed to become now that it is finally actually closed. It officially closed in March of 2001. It reopened in September of 2001 because material from the World Trade Center attacks went here to be sorted And there were about 25 different government agencies working that site as part of the investigation into the September 11th attacks. That effort officially ended in August of 2002. And since then, the park has been undergoing the most ambitious reclamation and sort of creative reuse effort since Central Park was made in the 1850s. And it is, if you have a chance to go out there they have Discovery Days, I highly recommend it. It's absolutely beautiful, surprisingly beautiful for knowing its history. So I mentioned Fresh Kills was the last landfill that we had. It was the last place for any of our solid waste disposal. Like, that was our one answer to solid waste disposal. But there were many, many other options before Fresh Kills became the only one. We had incinerators. We had thousands of incinerators all over the city. Many were apartment house incinerators. But when the United States Supreme Court shut down ocean dumping, we went gangbusters building incinerators, big ones, all over the city. This is where many of them were. The previous map is probably a little bit closer. MWC is municipal waste combustion. And then we also had landfills all over the place. This is just a partial list of places that we often now forget were originally landfills, but are now, if you go to Floyd Bennett Field or you drive out Flatbush Avenue toward Marine Park, Pennsylvania Avenue in Brooklyn, these are Flushing Meadows, famously host of the World's Fair twice, all landfill. Rikers Island still has one of the worst rat problems in the city, in part because the bulk of that island is badly built landfill. So, can we look at waste management as it's conducted today and decide that it's a success? Remember this cartoon I started with. We generate garbage. We generate more tonnages of garbage now than we ever have. And even with very sophisticated technology like these compactor trucks, which, if the conditions are right, can hold as much as 14 or 15 tons, they're not horses and carts, but it's the same idea. You have physical laborers picking up stuff that New Yorkers have let go of and tossing it into a vehicle that then goes to a facility where it is offloaded to take its next part of its journey. Fresh Kills, as I mentioned, closed to garbage in March of 2001. But look where our garbage goes now. This map is not up to date. It's from 2005. So the landfill had been closed for 4 years. We were sending, already by then, we were sending garbage all over the country, and we still are. This is a synthesis of one of the challenges of waste generally. We spend so much time focused on municipal solid waste as really a central problem, and in fact it is. But if we look at it in the context of the larger waste stream that is generated across the country, it is a tiny, tiny percentage. In fact, this 3% figure may be generous. So what are in those other categories? That's a really good question. And the answer is hard to find. It depends on which specific authorities you're looking to for the answer and how things are measured and how they are reported and what kinds of regulatory oversight requires what kind of reporting. I generally avoid long texts in my PowerPoints, but this is the key idea here. We don't have an idea of the quantity of non-household solid waste produced in North America. In other words, what's in that 97%? When we do have ideas of sub-quantities, we don't have good classifications. So we don't know what we're quantifying. The 97-to-3 ratio might be okay to use as an illustrative point of relative scale. But since modern waste is characterized by extreme tonnage, toxicity, and heterogeneity, then we have no reliable data on any of the three things that characterize most waste produced in North America. This means it's hard to take action because we do not have actionable objects or information to act upon. That's key. This is just one, I think, really lovely illustration of what happens to different kinds of wastes and where do they end up. If you follow all of these arrows, it's kind of scary. So are there answers? Maybe. One I would suggest that we give a whole lot more attention to and resources to is industrial ecology, in part because as a discipline, it studies the totality of the relationships between different industrial activities, their products, and the environment. It identifies ways to optimize the network of all industrial processes, and it helps raise key research questions so that we can set priorities among the numerous studies of materials flows and networks. This is key, materials flows and networks. It puts them in a dynamic context of both technical and market change. Or another way to say this that's perhaps less elegant but more straightforward, it helps us see, it helps us understand what are all the elements, how do they relate to each other, what are their consequences, what's their connection to the market, from the extraction perspective, from manufacture, from distribution, from consumption, from discard, from breakdown. Industrial ecology can shed light on all of those processes. We also can get a lot more serious about extended producer responsibility. It means very simply what the manufacturer puts into the world, she is responsible for taking back at the end of its useful life and turning it into something that is useful again, or that is discarded in a way that has makes no environmental damage. This is another sort of just a Venn diagram of looking at another way of thinking about extended producer responsibility. And then there's political activism. And I was careful in choosing that phrase because it's perhaps it's one that puts people off. But the illustration here is Iron Eyes Cody, an actor who was featured in the most famous public service advertisement ever created on behalf of Keep America Beautiful. This is the famous crying Indian advertisement. I can run it for you if you want. I've never found this in high enough resolution to see it clearly. But that tagline, people start pollution, people can stop it. Keep America Beautiful is an organization that was founded by beverage container manufacturers once they started creating disposable containers and people started disposing of them by throwing them out their car windows and similarly casual forms of litter. They were getting pushback from state legislators. And so they said, wait, we got to get in front of this. So they invented things like the idea of the litter bug, the idea that people start pollution. It completely diverts attention from the corporate source, the far greater power of manufacturing and extractive industries in creating forms of waste that we then have to deal with. The people start pollution tagline, if that's true, then the responsibility for stopping it rests on our shoulders as individuals, which is where you get things like municipal recycling programs, which is essentially an extension of the individual responsibility for litter and pollution. And yet, recycling, for the most part, doesn't, at least the way it's structured right now from the municipal level, does not do a whole lot to help the planet. So how do we fix it? These are, by priority, the ideas that we should be looking at with far more attention to reduce the quantity of all different forms, learning what they are, and then figuring out how to either find less harmful substitutes or shut down entire manufacturers altogether. So this is optimistic. It's almost like a technical blueprint for a future, but we could do it if we want to. I'm trained in anthropology, and one of the reasons I love it as a discipline is that I finally understood from inside anthropology that we invented everything, all the systems that surround us, political, economic, social, just everything. We created it, not in a vacuum, but it wasn't handed down as like laws of physics. If we invented it, we can change it. So how do we do that? That then gets back to sort of the nub of the whole question. And that's the end.